Hello and welcome back to Rockanory. I'm Zoe Howe, and this week I'm going to be reading a sort of rejigged section of the new book that I've just written. It's coming out in July and it's called How's Your Dad? Living in the Shadow of a Rock Star Parent. And it's obviously all about kids, the kids of people in the music industry, but it's a slightly alternative perspective because obviously this is a subject that gets looked at a lot in the media. But there are certain preconceptions that we have about those people as a result, and this is just an opportunity to kind of try and get a bit of balance. And I did a reading from this book last week at the Writing on the Wall Festival in Liverpool, which was an absolutely fantastic event. And I did have some videos, some live videos from that event, but for some reason I can't seem to upload them, so I'm just going to read a bit to you now from what I read. And it's a kind of slightly rejigged. It's about the kids of the Beatles, this particular bit. It was a Beatles event, Writing on the Wall. So here goes. My latest book concentrates on the sons and daughters of major figures in the music industry. The music industry as opposed to famous people per se, as I think there are certain challenges and situations that are particular to those born to so-called rock royalty. And while I in no way wish to taint how we feel about an artist's legacy, obviously a great innovator does not necessarily make a great parent. It's tricky when it comes to being the son or daughter of a successful and revered musician, whether you choose the same path or not, but particularly if you do. And while the descendants of McCartney, Harrison and Starkey all bear the weight of their family legacy in their own individual ways, I can think of no more complete or complicated examples of the megastar dad syndrome than Julian and Sean Lennon, albeit in entirely different ways. People tend to assume it must be generally quite easy for the offspring of a star. You probably want for nothing. You probably not need to really do anything if you didn't want to. And if you did, doors would be flung open wherever you chose to go. And if you wanted to join the family business, you're likely to be at least introduced to some of the right people, even if it's up to you from then on. Indeed, while there are obviously some serious benefits, the drawbacks can be great. And the bigger a star the parent is, the greater the drawbacks can be. And even now, there are few stars that can rival the Beatles. One of the issues with being the child of any well-known figure is the fact that whatever you do is automatically upstaged by the fact that your famous parent merely exists. They might not even be there, but a healthy percentage of people, say at your own gig, will be there just to corner you at the end to say, "How's your dad?" in a slightly over-familiar way. There's a sense that if the die-hard fans' approach is anything to go by, they do in some way own a bit of your parent. They certainly feel their relationship with them predates yours. And whether it's an attempt to open a conversation and make you like them, or subconsciously remind you of your place and that you'll never escape that legacy, not even on the one night that's your own, wording one's opening gambit in this way doesn't always go down well. The teenage Zack Starkey expressed his irritation at people only talking to him because of who his dad is, quite openly. The only time this is reversed is when the person talking to you is from a similar parentage. Dave Davis's son, Christian, was relieved when Zach's younger brother Jason approached him in the playground on his first day at secondary school and said, "Your dad's in the Kinks, isn't he?" Solidarity at last. After all, a lot of kids tend to actively ignore the children of rock stars after coming to the conclusion, before bothering to find out, of course, that they're arrogant and unapproachable. This is why they have to go to school with other rock stars' kids. It's alienating to make them do otherwise, but more on that later. Fans often home in on their favourite musician's progeny, like they're a piece of memorabilia on display. And you have to love those fans, of course. They're the ones to thank for, say, the fact you maybe went to a nice school, had a cool haircut, went on some great holidays. Yes, it's your parents' talent, but those people appreciated it, bought the record, the t-shirt, and the tickets to see the concert. So you have to love them and show grace when they want to love you. But there are times when this kind of appreciation by proxy can veer into the inappropriate, especially if you're made to feel as if you're invisible during your big moment. John Lennon was of course the ultimate star to many, and therefore Sean Lennon suffered the ultimate example of this and was basically just trying to be born. It was a difficult birth, in John's words, not because of Yoko's age, but because of a screw-up in the hospital and the price of fame. Somebody had made a transfusion of the wrong blood type into Yoko. She starts to go rigid and then shake from the pain and trauma. I ran up to this nurse and said, "Go get a doctor." He walks in, hardly notices Yoko, goes straight for me, smiles, shakes my hand and says, "I've always wanted to meet you, Mr. Lennon. I always enjoyed your music." Of course, part of this might be seen as a conscious or unconscious response to the then seemingly universally unpopular Yoko, latent or not so latent racism or misogyny, or just that inherent ownership and protectiveness that people felt. about the Beatles when they got married. Yoko being the obvious example, but Cynthia went through it, as did Linda, as did Maureen. It wasn't easy or particularly safe to be a Beatles wife at the best of times, and the stress was tripled when trying to wheel a baby out of harm's way amid the cooing masses, begging for a chance to touch or even hold the baby of a Beatle. Fans would even stuff chewing gum in the front door keyhole of the Lennons' flat so they couldn't get in, so they could swarm around the pram. On the upside, this did at least mean that the Beatle-bairns received phenomenal amounts of birthday cards and gifts every year from their dad's admirers. Julian's start in life in Liverpool was at the peak of Beatlemania, but at the time, Cynthia was not particularly recognisable as John's wife, because of course she was supposed to be a secret. John was away when she was in hospital expecting the baby, and she sparked plenty of gossip, as she was the only mother-to-be who didn't have any visitors, which it was assumed meant she was a single girl who'd made a bit of a mistake. But when John finally arrived 3 days after Julian's birth, the nurses were, as Cynthia recalls, distinctly friendlier than they had been when I first arrived. John's visit was brief, but had a dramatic effect. John held Julian's tiny hands and said, "Who's going to be a famous little rocker like his dad then?" Or because of his dad, perhaps. No disrespect to the obviously talented Julian, but a lot of the buzz around him when he broke through musically in the 80s, after his father's death, can't not have had something to do with his striking resemblance to John. It hits home on the Chuck Berry film Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, where Berry performs with an array of stars in a concert musically directed by Keith Richards. Berry makes it clear he'd have invited John Lennon, who was a big fan of Berry's, to play. In his place, Julian was invited to sing at the concert. Julian gave a brilliant performance, grinning through the inevitable cries of "Doesn't he look like his pa?" from Berry. But there is a terrible moment at the end of the number when Julian bows and Berry shouts, Julian Lennon!" It's a shock for the viewer, let alone anyone else, and the young Lennon looks momentarily crushed. The Beatles' kids are as different to each other as their parents were from each other, but generally speaking, the onus is largely on being normal, particularly in the case of the McCartneys. They went to regular schools, but they also received some of their education at what was about as far from a normal school as possible, the expensive and bohemian Hampstead private school, King Alfred, which is still a mecca for rock stars' kids today. Teachers would be referred to by their first names. You didn't have to do homework if you didn't want to, and life was pretty cool. Ringo's kids also went to King Alfred for a while, which makes sense and shouldn't be sneered at. Considering you're likely to be bullied at school if you wear the wrong socks or you've got ginger hair, it's actually cruel for a celebrity to send their kids to a really normal school where they're inevitably singled out because they've got no hope of being normal. They'll always stand out. They still have to cope with being picked up in a nice car while the rest of their compadres trudge off to the bus stop. They still have to cringe silently on parents' evenings, walking ahead of Dad in his leather trousers, for example, and Mum in all her groovy braless glory, while everyone else's parents wear suits. So really, Stella, Mary, Zach, Jason and co. shouldn't be embarrassed that their rock and roll parents sent them to a rock and roll school. It's probably what kept their self-esteem intact during those teenage years that are tricky at the best of times, let alone when your dad is one of the biggest, richest stars popular culture has ever known, and you look like him, and you're told that you look like him all the time. It didn't stop them going off the rails, in the case of Jason Starkey, who became a bit of a wild child, and Zach, who also had the option of bolting to Uncle Keith Moon's pad in the West End whenever he felt like it. But they went off the rails amongst more like-minded souls than they might have done if they'd seen out their school years in the local comprehensive. The contrast between having a flashy dad like Ringo and a mad bad mentor in Mooney and going to a beige state school might have unhinged them even further. And it wasn't as if Starkey Sr. could say much to reprimand his kids or keep them on the right track. Around the time Jason was arrested on drugs charges, Ringo's drinking was out of control. Keith Moon, in Zach's eyes, was the greatest drummer ever, in contrast with how he saw his own father, who he described, maybe unfairly, as a good timekeeper, but not a great drummer. Ouch. Cheers, son. Mooney rather sweetly acknowledged Zach Starkey's obsession with him by giving him an expensive drum kit in one of his many spontaneous moments of generosity. He apparently had no memory of this act of kindness when it was subsequently mentioned to him, but that didn't matter. Zach might not have been interested in becoming his dad the way people might have expected him to, but he was damn well going to turn into Keith Moon. And in years to come, he came as close as anyone really could to succeeding, when after extensive practicing and honing his Moonisms on the drums, Pete Townsend himself proclaimed him to be the most accurate emulator of Keith's style. Well, it looks like I'm running out of time there, but that was a really short extract of the reading I did at Writing on the Wall at Liverpool the other week, and I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned, spread the word, and I'll see you next week.